Divisions on the campaign trail.
He's a threat to our freedom. He's a threat to our democracy.
He's the most corrupt, the most incompetent president in the history of our country.
Mirror the divides in America's houses of worship.
The reason I ended up leaving that church was he was going on a tangent about, how trans rights was all bad and all that. And he said the civil rights movement was a mistake because now we have the gay rights movement.
But while many congregations are on the decline, some churches are seeing growth.
God says in the Bible, it is life. It begins at conception. That is righteous. And if someone is going to stand for that, I'm going to be with that person.
And as rhetoric over immigration heats up, how can Latino voters moderate political divides among their own communities?
It's not like they're cheerleaders for every party, but there's much less affective polarization or personal dislike between parties within the Latino community.
Welcome to PBS News Weekly. I'm Judy Woodruff. As the presidential election shifts into high gear, we look this week at the divisions fracturing the United States, part of my ongoing reporting series, America at a Crossroads. Up first, two takes on religion in America and its growing connection to our political divide. According to the Pew Research Center, more than a quarter of Americans now claim no religious affiliation, outnumbering any other single religious group. That follows decades of declining attendance at places of worship among white Christians, as well as the much smaller populations of Black Protestants and the Jewish community. I recently traveled to Illinois to examine how political divisions within the white faith community may be contributing to dwindling numbers. Across America each week, a familiar sound. Christians of different denominations gathering to sing, worship, and find community. Yet, in a growing number of places in the country, especially away from major cities, that sound has been growing softer. And in some, like this American Baptist Church in southern Illinois, which has existed in some form since 1868, it will soon grow quiet altogether.
I've done a handful of baptisms while I've been pastor here, but I've done over 25 funerals. So we're just not offsetting the losses at this point. And once you get to a certain point, it's almost impossible to pull out of the nosedive.
We've had a bunch of birthdays because we haven't been really meeting the last couple of weeks.
For more than 17 years, Ryan Burge has been the pastor of First Baptist Church, ABC, in Mount Vernon, one of the many mainline Protestant denominations that once dominated the nation's cities, towns, and countryside. Yet, since 1972, even as the country's population has grown over 60%, the proportion of white Americans attending churches like these, or even identifying as a Christian, has fallen precipitously. This church will close for good in July.
Religion is just not a central part of life for lots and lots of people. Today in America, about 25% of people report weekly church attendance, which puts us on par with a country like Italy. We were above 40% at one point. Amongst Catholics, 50% were weekly mass attenders in 1972. It's 20% today. So we're seeing a decline in religious attendance across almost every religious tradition, not just Protestants, but also Catholics as well.
And Jesus answered, "Very truly I tell you, no one..."
In addition to being a pastor, Burge is also a political scientist, teaching at Eastern Illinois University, where he studies the intersection of faith, politics, and the data behind it, describing these broad trends in his 2023 book, The Nones, about the growing share of Americans who identify as atheists, agnostics, or nothing in particular.
90% of Americans used to identify as Christians in 1972. It's about 65% today. And the share of Americans who are white Christians is now below half. The Nones have gone from, N-O-N-E-S, have gone from 5% of America in 1972 to almost 30% of America today. Amongst young people, it's over 40% of America. So we're facing an entirely different religious landscape today than we did even 30 years ago.
What is your best understanding of what's happened, of why fewer and fewer Americans feel some connection with a church or with a faith?
I think a lot of it is that Americans are anti-institutional now. And if you look at data and trust in institutions, we don't trust anything today as much as we trusted it 40 years ago, whether it be banks or unions or the media or religion. They're not seeing the value that religion plays in people's lives. And they're also thinking, and I think this is the thing that I push back against the most, that religion is only about belief. Religion's also a social enterprise. You come here, you sit next to people who are different than you learn how to volunteer, you learn how to run meetings, you learn how to fundraise, you learn about the Bible, but you also learn that other people are good people.
Good. How about some pulled pork?
Just a few miles away, some of those volunteers are helping the needy at this once-a-month food pantry, Angels on Assignment, where they provide free food, clothing, and help with expenses. The population of Jefferson County is shrinking as it ages, and its politics have swung further to the right. In 2000, voting 54% in favor of George W. Bush, to nearly 72% in favor of President Trump in 2020. Volunteers here join from across local denominations, but this outreach is organized by another mainline denomination in steep decline. The United Methodist Church has fallen from 11 million people in 1967 to half of that today, and in just the past 2 years lost about a quarter of its churches over issues surrounding same-sex marriage and LGBTQ clergy.
The Lord's table is the place where the distinctions between rich and poor, powerful and powerless are erased.
On a recent Sunday morning, though, First United Methodist pews were mostly full, with more joining online. And a full choir leading the congregation, including Keith and Cheryl Cox.
One more time.
A decade ago, Keith, a retired choir director, and Cheryl, a former German teacher and school administrator, moved from northern Illinois to the family farm here. The first church they joined closed, with too few members to sustain it. The next one, a Methodist church close to home, didn't align with their views on supporting border migrants through UMCOR, the church's relief agency, and the decision to close churches during the COVID-19 outbreak.
When I was on the church council and I heard the church leaders in that council being very unhappy about the fact that UMCOR was helping migrants and that the bishop was a terrible person for trying to keep people safe, that truly troubled me. And so I was not as interested in being a part of that church at that point in time.
Now, Keith and Cheryl drive 45 minutes each way, twice a week, to sing in the choir and worship at First United Methodist in Mount Vernon.
It's the best 45-minute drive that I have on a regular basis because I do feel uplifted when I go to the church. And I can't say that that's been true even at the other Methodist churches that I've been to.
And recognizing that politics was now a part of the church set of beliefs, how did that make you feel?
I think politics has invaded schools and healthcare and just about every aspect of our lives. So I shouldn't be surprised that it is invading in some ways in the church. But did it make me feel uncomfortable? Absolutely.
Singing alongside Keith and Cheryl Cox is Seth Calvert, who was drawn to this church first by its music, then by its message.
The Lord's table is the place where gay and straight and every other orientation in between can discover and receive the gift of God's life-giving grace.
It honestly, kind of rocks my world that there are people who are Christians who are actually open-minded.
That's the reasoning is they're going to...
Calvert lives in Mount Vernon with his husband, Brandon. He was raised Southern Baptist, but felt increasingly uncomfortable with that branch as he aged, especially as he heard things from the pastor that conflicted with his realization that he was transgender.
One of the examples that actually was the reason I ended up leaving that church was he was going on a tangent about, how trans rights was all bad and all that. And he said, the civil rights movement was a mistake because now we have the gay rights movement. And it was like, that's wrong.
You were hearing that, and then what were you thinking?
Like I had been taught, you know, if you see things going wrong, you always stay there and try and fix them. And that's what I was trying to do for years and years in that church. And then it got to the point that it's like, there's no way I can fix this. There's no way that me sticking around is going to be able to help these people see that what they're saying and doing is wrong.
It's almost like we've become a safe haven for refugees from other traditions and even other United Methodist churches who have felt excluded.
Victor Long leads this congregation of the United Methodist Church, whose motto is open minds, open hearts, open doors.
The churches they often come from are very rigid and narrow, and I know some have come from churches where politics was really the theme of the messages they heard, and they're looking for a safe place where they're not told what to believe, where they have freedom to ask questions and room to grow in their faith.
On the day we visited, Long delivered a sermon on the importance of unity.
The Lord's table is the place where Democrats can kneel alongside Republicans. Where else in the world are you going to see that?
I just felt like it was the right time for people to be reminded of that. And communion is the perfect setting for it, because that's when we come together as one and receive the bread and wine.
And when you say it's the right time, what's made it the right time, do you think?
Because all the other voices that get airtime in the church are about division and who's right and who's wrong, and we need to leave. And people need to hear that I believe Christ calls the church to unity. In spite of our differences. You know, it's not uniformity, but it's unity in the body of Christ.
Long says his congregation includes Republicans, Democrats, and everything in between, a hallmark of mainline Protestant churches. But that is becoming increasingly rare, according to Ryan Burge.
For a long time, we always thought that religion was the first lens and politics was downstream of that. So, what party I voted for, I looked at the Bible, I think about my theology, how I view the world, and then I picked Republican or Democrat. Now things have changed. The recent data says that we pick our religion based off our politics. So if I'm a Republican, I'm going to seek out a congregation that affirms my views and really tells me what I want to hear. So that's why a lot of people have left religion over the last 50 years. So even today, amongst liberals, 50% of them are non-religious. Amongst conservatives, it's only 12%. So what we're seeing more and more is people go, well, I can't do that.
Much like Mount Vernon's First United Methodist Church, not all white Christian congregations are in decline. Many evangelical churches, like one we visited in Tennessee, are bucking that attendance trend, seeing strong growth as it's leaned into right-wing politics. In a country where many pews increasingly sit empty, twice a week in Mount Juliet, Tennessee, outside of Nashville, hundreds gather to sing, worship, and find community in the converted tent of Global Vision Bible Church. They're led by Pastor Greg Locke, a one-time fundamentalist Baptist who gained fame and followers over the past decade while taking hardline positions on issues like gender-neutral bathrooms in Target stores.
What you are targeting are perverts, pedophiles, people that are going to harm our children.
Calling COVID-19 a hoax.
If they go through round two and you start showing up all these masks and all this nonsense, I'll ask you to leave. I will ask you to leave.
Claiming that Democrats could not be Christians.
You cannot be a Christian and vote Democrat in this nation. They are God-denying demons that butcher babies
and spreading election fraud claims.
Global Vision Bible pastor Greg Locke told me he was at the U.S. Capitol getting to the steps, praying and preaching while the insurrection went on behind him.
There was a time, I think, that maybe I felt it was my responsibility to play to the division a little bit more maybe than I do now. And I'm very demonstrative, I'm very conservative, very well known and outspoken for my political and religious beliefs. But I think we're at a place that if we don't figure out now how to bridge the chasm, we're never going to.
You consider yourself an evangelical?
Yes, although that is a hijacked term, I think, in the day and age in which we live, because there was a time that if you said you were an evangelical, it really meant a handful of things. You believed in the inerrancy of Scripture, the second coming of Christ, Jesus Christ is the only way to heaven, and you shared your faith. But now if you say you're an evangelical, well, then that means you vote a certain way, you dress a certain way, you're a certain denomination. And so I think it's been hijacked by a political agenda in some ways.
That political agenda dates back decades to the late 1970s and the rise of Baptist minister Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. In 1980, white evangelicals abandoned fellow evangelical Democrat Jimmy Carter and voted for Ronald Reagan, who embraced Falwell and his culturally conservative agenda, starting a trend that has only grown. 3/4 of white evangelicals voted for George W. Bush, John McCain, and Mitt Romney for president, and 8 in 10 voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020.
So the church had about 100 people by 1996.
American Baptist pastor and political scientist Ryan Burge.
Today, churches have become so homogenous. You know, white evangelicalism is 80% Republican today. If you go to a white evangelical church, you're probably not going to find a single Democrat in the congregation, and the pastor's probably also a strong Republican as well. So you're going to hear one message and one understanding of the world.
And that trend, he says, was only accelerated by COVID-19 and the way the pandemic response was politicized.
Pastors have always sort of like dodged landmines during their sermons because they don't want to wade into these issues. The problem with COVID was you couldn't dodge the landmines anymore. You had to make a decision, mask or no mask. Distancing or no distancing, all online, all in person, what do we do?
And when he had called her,
Pastor Locke refused to close down his church during the pandemic, defying state authorities, and warned his members not to wear masks, nor to get vaccinated.
Is the fact that without the grace of God, we would all be in hell. He saved us.
But I think COVID showed us there's a lot of people that are not willing to say anything when the government stands up and says, this is the way that it should be. Well, we became very quickly well known for, no, that's not the way it's going to be. We're going to put our feet in the ground and we're going to draw a line in the sand and say, no, this is what the Bible teaches. And come hell or high water, we're going to believe the Bible.
There's a lot of fake in the world today.
That was a message that strongly resonated with some of his members, like Boston native Andrew Flessa, who first came to this church in 2022 through the Reawaken America tour, a right-wing religious revival. He then moved from Texas to Tennessee to join Greg Locke.
There's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of confusion. So when you find a voice that you can tell has a lot of truth coming out of them, then you do start to realize, okay, this is a move of God. He's a mouthpiece of God. So I want to be a part of this.
Billy Kennedy started coming to Global Vision more than a decade ago and found a personal connection with Pastor Locke.
He explains everything from top to bottom, line by line. He just makes it so easy, and the freedom just flows.
We moved here in 2022.
Tracy Wells also moved to join this church, in her case, all the way from Oregon with her husband.
At that time, we had been looking in Oregon for a church, and with COVID, everything just closed up. So there were no churches, and we started following online every Sunday and every Wednesday. And finally we said, why do we want to be in Oregon when we really want to be in the church? So we sold everything and we moved here, and we have not looked back.
There's so much divisiveness in this country right now.
Milo Wright is a lifelong Tennessean who found this church nearly 15 years ago and found a community too.
Whether it be political, whether it be religious, there's just too much lukewarmness in the church where people aren't firm in their beliefs. They're not firm believers of the Bible because they allow things to creep into their church that shouldn't be there.
Thou man of God.
For this group, their church and their faith greatly inform the way they view politics and their choices in this year's presidential election.
It's whoever stands with Israel. And at least in President Trump's last go-around, he was much more close with Israel, much more pro-Israel, and Biden has not been very strong in terms of Israel, and that's one of the commandments in the Bible. You know, whoever blesses Israel, whoever protects Israel will also receive my blessing, will also receive my protection.
There are many issues in the church that we look at biblically. We don't look at them politically. Abortion is one. God says in the Bible, it is life. It begins at conception. That is righteous. And if someone is going to stand for that, I'm going to be with that person.
Pick up on that, Milo, on this question of what former President Trump believes about reproductive rights. If one believes abortion is wrong, his view is that it should be up to the state to decide. Is that a position you're comfortable with?
I'm very comfortable with that because each state contains a different demographic. So each state should be controlled by their demographic. That's the way our government works.
At the same time, they push back against the idea that someone who supports reproductive rights, as President Biden does, could be considered a Christian.
Does his practicing Catholicism line up with his pro-abortion stance? I ask you that. It doesn't really pass the smell test in my book.
Their support of former President Trump was also qualified, a question of choosing between the better of two imperfect choices.
There was a time that there was no doubt it was all Trump. It was Trump, Trump. Well, I feel that Trump, I don't know who'll be president, but at least he loved the country.
And there's no magic bullet. Trump's not a magic bullet whatsoever. So, you know, it just kind of depends on how much faith do you put in the Bible or how much faith do you put in a man, a politician.
I don't think either man could be held to a high Christian standard.
For Milo Wright, the critique is broader than religion.
The border was pretty tight when Trump was in. The economy was pretty good pre-COVID when Trump was in. The stock market was way up. With Biden, I don't see any results.
You know, I'm not nearly as Trumpian in some ways as I used to be. But is he better for the nation than Joe Biden? Oh, 10,000%. Joe Biden's ruined the nation. He's destroyed the economy. He can talk about how much the economy is doing, but the economy is worse now than it has been in the history of any of our lifetimes. And it's only going to get worse. We literally, you know, took Locke Media.
Despite evidence showing a strong U.S. economy, Greg Locke says many in his congregation are suffering. And yet he's also dismayed by Trump's unwillingness to support a national ban on abortion.
Biblically, I believe there's never a time that we should opt for abortion. Adoption over abortion 1,000 times every single time.
So how much do you plan to advocate for him this year, from now until the election?
I don't plan to advocate for him at all, except go to the voting booth.
So it's different from 2020?
100% different. I'm bored with politics because politics is not going to save this nation. Politics are going to be corrupt until Jesus comes. And so I thought, you know what? I've wasted a lot of energy on trying to change something that I'm not going to change.
How do you see the country working its way through this divide right now? Do you see people coming together? Do you see one side weakening?
I don't know that either side is weakening. I think both sides are emboldening themselves, and I think that's going to be dangerous. I don't know what that looks like. Inevitably, I don't want some kind of conflict. You know, I don't want some kind of civil war. I don't want cessationism. You know, people break. I don't want all that. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure that we can fully bridge the gap that we've created. I mean, we are more divided now than we've ever been. If Donald Trump gets to the White House, is that going to change? Probably not. And I've been part of that problem in the past. That it's either Democrat or it's either Republican. No, I'm pretty messed up about both of them at this point.
What caused you to rethink that?
I tell people, you know, I used to fight Democrats, now I fight demons, right? I used to fight the left, and I'm like, you know what, I want to see people set free, and I don't care what side of the aisle they're on. And so I had to get to a place where I was like, You know what? Republicans aren't going to save us. Democrats aren't going to save us. As far as I'm concerned, they're two heads of the same snake. They both have their problems.
I think that's interesting. I always wonder, as a political scientist, how many decisions are made strategically and how many are made spiritually.
For pastor and political scientist Ryan Burge, Greg Locke's journey raises some familiar questions about faith and following.
We've seen a lot of people do this. They've really gone hard in one direction and then backed off over time. Even if you looked at Billy Graham, for instance, he used to preach a pretty fire and brimstone message, but near the end of his life, he got a lot softer on a lot of gospel issues. I think a lot of people realize that you can build up an audience, but what's it worth? You know, long term for the health of my soul and me as a person.
So you're saying it's hard to believe that he's sincere? Is that what you're saying, or?
Anytime a public figure changes their direction, it's always a question of what's directing the ship, what's guiding the show. I can't speak into Greg Locke's heart. I hope to God that he finds a gospel that's redemptive, that's salvific, that brings people together, not pushes people apart, that realizes that, you know, Christianity is a religion that builds bigger tables, not taller walls. Unfortunately, the message of taller walls and keeping people out tends to do really well in America.
And Latino Americans make up nearly 20% of the U.S. population. This year are expected to be a critical constituency for both Republicans and Democrats in swing states. And yet, the very idea of Latinos voting as a bloc betrays the diversity of history, culture, and perspectives within that community, which also may help strengthen it against the polarization we see in the country more broadly. This is your parents, your mom.
My dad.
Sylvia Gonzalez Anders is a 67-year-old United States Air Force veteran.
We were considered Mexican Americans. That's what everybody, called us.
I'm getting promoted to lieutenant commander.
Raf Polo is a 73-year-old United States Navy veteran.
At home, we spoke Spanish. We drank the Cuban cafecito. Have you ever had that? You just go. When we left the house, the moment we stepped out, we were Americans.
They both live in Tucson, Arizona. They consider themselves Latino, and they are both politically active. But when it comes to the issues like undocumented immigration, they simply don't see eye to eye. How do you view the people who are trying to come into this country without documentation?
They must be pretty desperate to walk thousands of miles to get here and to go through all that agony. But as far as being on the border, I've been down there. I mean, we're 100 miles from Nogales, from the border. We're not getting overrun by millions of immigrants.
That's not how Polo sees it.
I think they need to come in legally. A lot of the folks that are coming through, a lot of them, are not good people. The rapists, murderers, and I'm pretty convinced that terrorists are here.
When it comes to former President Trump, who famously launched his campaign by denigrating Mexicans,
they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
And has repeatedly disparaged immigrants as he calls for more restrictive policies.
His first comment was that all Mexicans are rapists and murderers. What was I supposed to have open arms? That's not true. My family is nothing like that, and most immigrants are nothing like that. I'm not going to stand by and let them say Mexicans are terrible or Latinos are terrible. That's not acceptable. That is not American.
I'm from New York, so I grew up with people like Donald, so it doesn't bother me.
And you think he'd be a good president again?
I think he'd be outstanding.
That division reflects one playing out across the country. And while Latinos have long been a key constituency of the Democrats, recent polling shows that the gap between the parties is tightening, with 44% of registered Latino voters favoring Donald Trump and 52% supporting Joe Biden.
The Latino community is so diverse, and we want to look at every group really based on their country of origin more than anything else.
Samara Klar is a professor at the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. She tells us these differences of opinion should not come as a surprise.
So, to say how do Cubans compare with Mexicans is almost saying, like, how do Canadians compare with Japanese immigrants? I mean, these are two completely different countries, people who come here at different times under different circumstances.
She studies how an individual's personal identities and social surroundings influence their political attitudes and behaviors, and says because of common experiences among Latinos, she sees less partisan hostility.
So for white Democrats and white Republicans, there's not a lot that really bonds them. For Latino Democrats and Latino Republicans, we see linguistic ties, we see religious ties, we see experiences with discrimination, we see experiences as a minority or as an immigrant.
So as you think about Latinos as a voting bloc, what should we think about it?
Well, first, I would not think about Latinos as a voting bloc. Latinos are an incredibly diverse community of people. I mean, we have Latinos who come from dozens of countries all over the world, different nationalities, different backgrounds, different histories, different immigration patterns, different immigration eras. And it can be a little confusing because it makes it harder to understand voting patterns within this very diverse group of people.
At the same time, the sheer size of the Latino community hasn't always translated into political power or representation.
We're very often not made to feel that we fit in. We're not in the school books, we're not in the textbooks. So this is really wonderful representation because...
Marie Arana is an award-winning author, journalist, and the former inaugural literary director at the Library of Congress, where we met. In her new book, Latino Land, Arana has taken on an admittedly difficult task by attempting to cover 500 years of Latino history in the United States.
Even though we have a great number, millions of eligible voters, we do not necessarily register to vote. And that's a problem for us. That's a real problem for us.
What does that stem from? Where does that come from?
Well, it comes from the fact that your prejudice, discrimination, a sense of not fitting in. There's this sense that, why should we vote? We're not paid attention to anyway.
But now she believes that during this polarized period in our country, a diverse Latino community can help moderate American politics.
There is within the Latino population itself, we represent diversity within us because of the many races that we are. And I think in general, we are a moderating force.
Back in Tucson, Professor Klar says her research bears that out, showing a key difference between most Latinos and non-Latino white voters.
We find that for Latinos in Arizona and elsewhere across the country, they express much warmer feelings toward the other party. Their feelings toward their own party are about the same, so it's not like they're cheerleaders for every party. But there's much less affective polarization or personal dislike between parties within the Latino community.
And what's this over here on the left, upper left?
Oh,
2020?
Yeah.
That's true for Raf Polo. He says he hasn't let politics get in the way of his relationships. Can you talk to your friends who are Democrats about issues?
Yeah. We're all educated. We're experienced, successful people that don't need to use short words to express themselves.
You haven't built a wall between your house and a neighbor who's a Democrat or a liberal or something.
No. It's God, we got a bunch of liberals right down the street.
But Sylvia Gonzalez-Anders prefers to steer clear of politics with her Republican neighbors. She told us she has family members who support former President Trump, and that she struggles with the fact that other Latinos have a more negative view than she has toward new immigrants.
Well, I could get really dark about that. I could really think, well, if you're willing to turn against your own people and pull up the ladder behind you, that means that you have the same traits as somebody that just wants to get ahead at any cost. This is a lack of empathy, a lack of I got mine and I don't care if you get yours.
It's anyone's guess how this will break in such a hard-fought election year, but what's clear is that both campaigns will be making their case to the 36.2 million eligible Latino voters. That's it for this week's episode of PBS News Weekly. For all of us, thanks so much for watching.